Today we are going to paint a cute little field mouse. So I'm going to mix up colors for that. I've added in some acorns as well. I have some gray and some blacks mixed up from my last project, the ladybug and toadstools, or the little mushrooms. So I'm just going to re-wet this because it's what I'll be using for the white tummy. I am just going to mix it all together. That is the beauty of watercolor. Unlike acrylic or oil, you can just keep reusing your paints. And this is burnt sienna, raw sienna, and red oxide, or transparent red oxide. So I'll mix that up and add a bit more red oxide. And I'll wake up this black, sort of my homemade black mix of indigo, Payne's Gray, Winsor Violet, and burnt sienna. And then this is Lunar Black. Don't know if we need a ton of that because it's not a dark colored mouse, but it has a nice granulating property to it. It might just drop a tiny bit in. And now for the browns, go to the Van Dyke brown, just sort of a regular mid-tone brown. This is Holbein for the brand. Nice transparent color. And then this is Burnt Umber. It's funny how different paints dry differently. Burnt Umber always gets kind of crumbly out of the tube, so that's why it's nice to have it in this pan. Otherwise it sort of falls off your palette. But I think that one will be good for this mouse. Definitely some sort of straw, light brown color. So we'll use raw sienna for that. And then maybe just mixed with a touch of burnt sienna. Also grab some sepia. Again, I love granulating paints for painting fur. Maybe a little bit of light red, just mixed in with those two colors. And maybe yellow ochre. Just trying to think what I'm missing for this. Add that into the Van Dyke brown. And we'll start with that. Alright, so I have my mouse here, and this is kind of a sketchbook page. What I've been doing is just cutting out some Arches 140-pound cold press paper into a certain size. And then I'm going to bind them all together when I've done a bunch of them to make my own homemade sketchbook, just because I really like how the paper performs. And I like my hardcover sketchbook too, but I thought this would be a cool way to culminate all of my YouTube projects and tutorials. So I'm going to cover that with paper towel so I don't get it smudged or mucked up. Just lightening some of the darker graphite on the reference photo of the mouse. You can't actually see a tail, and then I'm going to do some sort of, well, try my best to do some grass here so you don't actually, I'm not going to be doing the feet. So I've changed that part a little bit. Starting off with my number 2 brush, I'm going to move in some clean water here. I like to keep the color mixing water separate. I have not painted animals for quite a time, so we'll just see how this goes. I'm going to paint around its cute little hand and just work on the belly right now. And I'll go a little over the bottom of the belly so that I get a fuzzy edge on the fur. Pick up my gray color, and we're only painting in the darkest areas. The rest will be left white, and then you can kind of tease out some of the little, make it look like fur. Little swipes of the tip of the brush. And just a little bit so far. I'll leave that at that for now. While that's drying, I will move to the tail. I am going to use sort of a just like a straw brown for the tail, like that color. Now my brush is clean and rinsed out, and I'm going to blend that. I made it damp, then I put wet paint over with one stroke, and now I'm just blending it out to the other side. That's how I usually do thin things like stems or tails. Gets a little thicker right where it joins with the mouse. Okay, I'm going to use my blow dryer and blow dry that layer and then get into the body. Now I'm going to do the head of the mouse. Number 2 brush, clean water. I'm going to just paint up to the ears. And around the eye. Now there's the bottom part of the chin and sort of snout area is white, so I'll try and do a little bit of gray. No idea how this is going to turn out. I've actually never painted a mouse, but there's always a time to try. I actually really like mice. Some people don't like rodents. I think they are adorable. Taking some tawny reddish brown. Now before I sort of lose that area, I'm just going to pat in a little bit of shadow for the white area. And then there's kind of a little whiskery cheek area here. My cat's in the background playing. And now I'm going to extend the clear water just on top of the head here, out the outline just a tiny bit. Take my Van Dyke brown and just again coax it with the tip of my brush in hopes to kind of indicate the fur, the fuzz. And just trying to add on different spots of color. There's lots of different browns in here. It's not all one brown, and it won't look very realistic. And just sort of stippling my brush. More Van Dyke brown to mix in. And so my wash is drying, so you can get a bit more marking and texture now as I'm going, but it's not completely dry. I'm going to just grab a little bit of quinacridone rose to make a very faint pink mixed with a bit of the brown I have here, just to paint the nose. It's a very slightly pinkish. I'm just going to wet the nose area with my 00. Grab that pinky brown. And just dab that in a little bit. Dab a little bit more brown in there. And I usually like to do the eye fairly soon as it in the painting. It helps bring the painting to life. So I have my homemade black, and I'm just going to do dry brushing and make sure I leave the two little spots where the highlights are. I'll outline them first. For now, that is good, and then I will just do the tiny little ring around the eye. Now I'll continue on with the body. Back to my number 2 brush. I'm going to paint into the brown so it blends. And I also will paint over slightly the edge so that it will blend and make that fuzzy edge. Van Dyke brown. Do the edges first while it's nice and wet. And then I'll pick up the reddish brown. Rinse that. Maybe get the raw sienna. And then I'm just going to drag some of this in. Back to Van Dyke brown. If you really squiggle your brush out, now it's nice and flattened out. Just making little furry textured marks. wake up the sepia, dab it, and then there's some darker sort of shadowy areas, which we'll just dab the sepia in. Then I will rinse, dab my brush, oops, not fully rinsed, spread it out with my fingers, and then just sort of swipe it through. It will spread out and do its own thing as it dries, but this will just help it. Also, any spot on the edges where it's not fuzzy enough. And then I think I'll just lift a little highlight here. One here. Same thing, splay out the brush and just swipe that through again. Seeing how wet my paper is, see what type of marks I can make right now. So it's dried but still damp. If it wasn't wet enough, I would just wet it again to do this. Now I'm just making little texture marks, and I'm doing this while it is a little bit wet, so they're not super hard with hard edges. Now I'm going to let this dry. I'm going to add in some of the ground, and I want to add in some green, but earthy sort of green. Got some Hooker's green here. That's not earthy enough. Try the Undersea green from Daniel Smith. It's a little bit better. Adding in some Van Dyke brown to it. That's better. A little bit more brown. Also some yellow ochre. Put it there. So around the acorns and a little bit over the bottom of the mouse. Lots of water there, so I'll spread what I have out. Over the bottom. And I'm just going to paint in a few strokes like this to begin with. Also with the brown, since this is kind of a autumn spread. Definitely hard to talk while you paint sometimes. Trying my best. I didn't used to be able to film, talk, and paint, which is kind of gotten used to it as my YouTube channel's evolved. Now I want some blurred color and also some actual blades of grass showing. But I want the blades of grass to fade into the paint, so I'll do those now. This is a number 2 brush, just up on its point. Then I'll also just make a bit of abstract. And then rinse my brush, drag that color around. This area is still quite wet. And rinse it out again, dab it, and then just make sure that I've got clean water here. So it will just fade out. Add a few more. Quite like doing this, quite fun. Okay, it's coming along nicely. I am going to leave that to dry, so I think I'll actually hit this with the hairdryer so I don't put my hand in it, and then we'll move to the next layer. Alright, so I'm going to add in the ears and the little hands or paws. First I'll do the paws. Not super detailed. Oops, got some gray on there. That's alright. I like a bit of an undershadow painted on. I'm using a sort of raw sienna color here, almost a bit of pink like the nose. And just delicately indicate these cute little paws. That'll be the first layer. We'll go back to that. And now we'll use number 2 brush and wet these little ears. I'll keep that inside part dry for now. Same color, sticking with the number 2, and we'll leave some light reflection showing through. Maybe just add in a little bit of reddish tinge on the edge there. Rinse the brush, just tease that edge to blend it. And tiny bit of wet there. This just looks more like a bit of a shadowy brown, so I'm going to mix in some Van Dyke brown, rinse my brush, and just sort of coax it through that area. Drop in a bit of gray for the shadow. So now we have most of the first layers on. You could leave it like this if you'd like, or you can refine it a little bit more. Take my smaller brush with the gray and just define the little muzzle a bit more. Blend that. A little bit of darker flecks up here. Using sepia. And then there's some little hairs going into the inside of the ear. Taking some burnt sienna, mixing it here, a little bit of sepia into it. I want to define around the eye a bit more. My loud chair. And I'm just sort of stippling away. I might switch to my better blending brush, the spotting brush for this. There. Rinsing it. This one doesn't make quite as fine little hairs, but it does blend out quite nicely. Now just sort of indicating, maybe with a bit lighter color, just sort of a bit of the shoulder area here. And I can see that the fur goes right up into like a little sleeve shape, not just as cut off as I have it. That's a bit better. I'm just going around with my 00 brush, making some nice furry texture in the direction the fur is growing, and then I can rinse and sort of blend one of the ends so it looks like fur sticking out of fur rather than just a bunch of little hatching lines. Now back to the muzzle. Dab my brush. I'm just going to make a few little dots for the whiskers. Like that. Just dab it. Make it a bit more faint with paper towel. Taking my spotting brush and just grabbing some of that light gray, I am just going to add that in under the ear for shadow. And on the back there. Back to the 00 for more texture. Sepia into the burnt sienna. Rinsing and blending. Now I will get more of my Van Dyke brown mix. Just go around the edge of the ear, wet on dry. Same with the other ear. Just define it a bit more. Maybe a tiny bit of this dark color just dabbed in there. More of the black for the eye. It does look very dark, but I'm just going to define the bottom a bit more. A little bit of an ellipse shape rather than a round circle for the eye. Just need a bit of a mark there though. better. Leaving that to dry. Go back to the nose and just define that a little bit more. Rinse the brush, add a little bit more blue to my gray. And just do some more detail flecks on the tummy. Not too many. Don't want to overdo it because it is mostly white. Rinsing. Definitely want to blend out those parts where the fur begins here. So it just looks like it's coming out of its fluffy white belly. A bit better. And defining the mouth a little bit more. Tiny bit of black into the gray. Looks like its little mouth is under the muzzle slightly. Oh, this is my very tiny brush. This is a 000. And it just sort of goes like that. Brush, I want a 00. And then I'll just do a little bit more shadow on the paws, hands. Okay, now I will again take a bit of black, mix with the light gray, try to do my best to do some cute little whiskers here. It's all about the direction of the whiskers. They're not straight, they are curved. Kind of crossing directions. This brush is so tiny, we'll have to pick up paint each stroke. Maybe a little bit darker on the ones that overlap the fur. Don't like that one better. Maybe a little shadow around the nose here. as well as the tail. All right, so I think that's good for now, and then I'll just paint in the acorns. All right, we'll just fill in these acorns to finish this off. Using the number 2 brush, I'm just going to first brush the acorn portion. Some of this reddish mix. Just drop it in, the color. Dabbing my brush, and then I'm just going to draw in some striations. There. Maybe just drop in a little touch of green still. And then I'll do the same for the other one. Just going to actually wait till that dries to bring that grass up. Rinse my brush out. I'll just hit this with the hairdryer. Now these are dry, so I will do the little caps. Again, wet wash with my number 2 brush. I'll add a bit more sepia in for the caps. Just sort of making very subtle texture there. Let that blend together. Okay, and again, just dry that with the hairdryer. Okay, back to the number 2 brush. Not going into too much detail with these, but I will now do some sepia with the red oxide, wet on dry. Define that bottom edge. Rinse your brush, catch that edge and blend it. blending with a clean damp brush. Grabbing some Van Dyke Brown. Dab that brush and then just sort of line beneath the cap a little bit. Just ever so slightly soften the edge. I am not using a reference photo, I am just drawing acorns or painting them from memory. But there's lots of acorn pictures you could look up if you're following along. Online, plenty of acorn pictures. A little bit more intense Van Dyke Brown with the very tip just defining the little stem. I will let that dry. Now I'm going to take some of that green because I just didn't quite get under that one acorn when I was doing that wash, so I'll just sort of fill that in a bit, and I guess right there as well. Rinse and blend. If you are trying this out and you're not having as much success with blending, it might be the paper you're using. If you're not using high quality paper, it can be very frustrating trying to blend and get the same effects. This is 140-pound cold press Arches watercolor paper. It's very good quality and 100% cotton. So if you want the exact results, I would recommend using this paper. Okay, now I will switch to my 00 brush and go back to the caps. I'm going to take this sort of raw sienna color here. I think I put some yellow ochre in there too. So I'm just sort of doing some little teethy strokes on here. Take the Van Dyke Brown now, the darker color, and just add a little bit of that into those little teethy marks. Now I will take Van Dyke Brown and move back to the acorns. I'm just going to dry brush on some lines. And then also just make a little nub at the bottom, like that. And then I will take my spotting brush just to define a bit of the cap. You lose some of your little teeth, that's fine. Just blends into the texture. And then darker still, just putting some sepia right on the corner. just there. And right below the little stems. Have a lot of fun with acorns. I think I'll leave them at that, and then I'll just add a little bit of shadow below them. Just taking my light gray, nice and watery, and kind of already did it with the grass, filling them in. But now I'll just swipe some of the gray underneath, extend it a little bit, rinse my brush, and just blend that out. And that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the little mouse tutorial. I'll see you next week for another video.